The UK already is a science superpower, right? We've been number one for citation weightings in the G7 every year going back to 2004. There's no doubt that our research leads the world. Where we have struggled is in the commercialization of that research, and where, if we take an even more clear-eyed view, one of the areas that we need to look at is some of the biases in those rankings. So Paul Nightingale and my former colleague in number 10, James Phillips, published something last week looking at, well, are we really world leading in science? And showed that the answer is probably yes, even in some of the cutting edge fields, but heavily biased by things like the presence of DeepMind and the publications of some very large organizations. So I don't think that ambition to get where we need to get by 2030 is unrealistic, but it requires, as Minister George Freeman has said, it requires us to be not just a science superpower, but an innovation nation. And one of the reasons why that's so essential is because it will supercharge our economic growth. It's a really exciting time to be in the tech industry. We're living through an area which is not so much paradigm shifting, as it says on the slide, as living through multiple phase shifts, a dizzying array of different phase shifts. And you'll see that theme run through what we're going to say today. In the Centre for Cognitive and Advanced Technologies within Fujitsu, we have the mission to revolutionize decision making. Why is that? Well, Ash Fontana, the venture capitalist, one of the world's leading venture capitalists, wrote in his book, The AI First Company, that where the companies that succeeded in the 20th century were those that leveraged land, labour and capital most effectively, those that succeed in the 21st will be those that leverage information. Leveraging information is fundamentally a human cognitive function. It's getting insight and foresight from data at unprecedented levels, at unprecedented speed and with unprecedented accuracy. I think technology is already revolutionizing decision making, and I hope you'll see why that is and how that might help to drive growth as we go through some of the more detailed elements of the presentation. The UK also faces some intractable challenges, and good strategy looks those challenges in the face, so I won't flinch from starting with a description. The UK's economic growth was ranked by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development the second worst in the G20 over the last year, and the forecast for the next financial year is that UK economic growth will go backwards. We will contract, and we'll be the only country, apart from Russia, that is true of. Why is that the case? Well, I would start by saying that I'm always wary of monocausal explanations for any complex phenomenon. But nevertheless, in this instance, I might permit myself one, which is to lean on the economist Paul Krugman's aphorism, which is that while productivity isn't everything, in the long run, it is almost everything. One of the reasons for the UK's challenges is the productivity gap that has opened up, particularly since 2007. So since the Second World War, we've had each generation more prosperous than the last. We've been able to get more productivity out per worker, per hour for every generation, and the consequence of that has been consistently increasing wealth for families and for individuals and for societies. And that trend line since 2007 has begun to go in a different direction. You can see on the chart on, I think as you look at it, the right-hand side possibly, but where labour productivity has departed from that trend line such that it's now 22% below, I believe it's 22% below where it would have been if we continued on where it was previously. And that comes from quite a low baseline in the UK of productivity, so low growth from a low baseline. We're also 13% below the G7 average. You might think, well, these are all abstract numbers, Keith, why should I care? Well, the think tank, the Resolution Foundation, in a statistic that was popularised this week through a Panorama programme, described how what that means in practice is a significant gap in household income displayed on the chart. And for the average worker, we are all £11,000 worse off as an average worker in the UK as a result of that productivity gap. Why does that matter? Well, not only does it mean it matters for all of you because you've got 11k less in your pocket than you would have done if we'd continued on trend, it also matters because that kind of money would also help to drive growth in GDP, and that growth in GDP would be reinvested in schools, in health, in public services, in infrastructure, in research and development. And in doing so, what you then get is a kind of flywheel where greater productivity begets greater productivity and greater economic growth begets greater economic growth. So we have to tackle the productivity challenge if we're to tackle the UK's growth challenge. How do you tackle a productivity challenge? Well, any business leader will tell you that there are four principal ways. On the one hand, you can decrease the costs, and that's true for companies and it's true for countries. So that might be things like the cost of energy, it might be things like the cost of materials, the cost of natural resources. You could decrease the costs, and now you can invest more elsewhere, and you can increase the productivity of your organisation. You can add labour. So at the UK level, you can increase like the number of people in the population. Now you can manufacture more, and historically now you can provide more services. You can add capital. You can invest more in your infrastructure, in your people, and through adding that capital, you can help to drive increased productivity. Or, and crucially for today, you can increase the number of ideas and the application of those ideas in the way in which your company or your country or you as an individual go about your business on a day-to-day basis. Costs, labour and capital are all things that are tightly constrained. Costs, it takes a very long time to change the price of energy. Labour is driven by long-term demographic trends about which I think governments and companies can do little. Capital is constrained by the bond market and the financial markets. You can only invest as much as they are willing. And we could have a big macroeconomic debate about how much governments can borrow, but nevertheless, broadly, there are some constraints on what you can do. Ideas, there are no constraints beyond our imagination. Bayes' innovation report a couple of years ago claimed that 51% of productivity growth is from innovation. So if that is true, that's the area where we need to focus to adopt that growth gap that we highlighted on the previous slide. Really important thing I want to draw out at this point is that is about technology, and I'm going to talk about technology, and so is Jason, and so is Alana. But it's also about the way in which we apply that technology. So that 51% of productivity growth was as much from the redesign of business models, from the redesign of organizations, from the changing of hierarchies, from true digital transformation, as opposed to mere modernization and the application of technologies to processes and the way you did things before. I think you need that in companies. I think if you're not reimagining your company around these technologies, then you are probably failing. I think we need it at the level of societies, and we need it at the level of states. Japan talks about achieving the complete digital transformation of society by 2025. The UK science superpower, I think, shows that we get the same urgency. And I think the machinery of government reforms that you saw Rishi Sunak announce a few weeks ago when we created the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology were another recognition of the need to do real things. There was almost no political capital gained from that decision, and yet he made it anyway. And I think it shows the seriousness with which we're taking these, but we could, of course, do more. When we launched the integrated review, it's recently refreshed and came up with the science superpower agenda, our argument within the team was that automation, robotics and AI were revolutionising our path to prosperity and national power. They enabled companies and countries to scale to produce wealth independently of the number of people in the company or the country, for possibly for the first time. And that growth, I think you can now see backed up in statistics like those on the chart from the Bank of America that show the number of workers needed at S&P 500 companies to generate $100 million in revenue over time, with that precipitate drop from the 1980s to recently, where it's far fewer people needed to generate the same amount of revenue. At the same time, and more recently, we've seen the cost to train AI systems dropping precipitately, and that is now embedded in the changes you see on the graph in producing more with less. So one of the ways we increase productivity, one of the ways we get more out of workers per hour, one of the ways we increase our GDP and our growth is through the application of these technologies. Interestingly, I think in 2010 there was no AI anywhere. Since about 2016, it's increasingly been everywhere. It's in your Maps apps, it's in trading on the stock exchange, it's there in your personally curated, tailored social media feed, it's there when you search on Google, it's in almost everything, touching every element of everyday life, and yet we haven't really felt it. The Alan Turing Institute said last week that the release of ChatGPT changes that. For the first time, people can feel how AI is going to change the world, change their companies, change their lives. I think really interesting to demonstrate that and perhaps to drive the point home is Professor Ethan Mollick at the Wharton Business School, who I still think, and I know this is on camera, is about the best Twitter follow I've ever found. You're welcome, Ethan. Ethan Mollick has said, in taking recent survey data, that it seems like ChatGPT, for those that are applying it, is driving an increase in productivity of, on average, between 30 and 80%, depending on the industry that you're in. 30 to 80% increases in productivity. Compare that to the gap that we have in growth of 22% and 13%, 22% from the baseline, the gap from the OECD of 13%, and you can begin to see how these technologies can help us address fundamental challenges. To sort of illustrate a little bit further of where we've come from to talk about where we're going, What you see on the slide is Professor Hans Moravec's Landscape of Human Competence. Hans came up with that in a paper in 1997 titled When Will Computer Hardware Exceed the Human Brain? And he described the rising tide of AI capabilities, so the sea represents AI, and the land were those things that we then considered to be uniquely human capabilities. In 2018, MIT physicist Max Tegmark took that description and turned it into the graphic that more or less you see on the slide. Obviously, for copyright purposes, we've got our own version, but nevertheless. And what you see there is things that we once thought were uniquely human capabilities already submerged. And what we've done is redefine what we mean by human intelligence, increasingly to mean those things that machine can't quite do yet. So we used to say it was chess. When it can beat us at chess, it's truly intelligent. When it can beat us at Go, when it can do, well, it's done all those things. The things in blue are interesting because where I've put those squares around it, those are things on this graphic that I have had to concede that machines are doing at least close to the level of humans since I started using this graphic in about 2019. So you can see that rising tide is very rapid to the point where probably I need to redraw the graph, but then I can't make this point. So I think we're seeing rapid changes and they're only going to increase. One of the things Tegmark said in 2018 is the real change, the most profound change, comes when machines begin improving machines. In 2021, a paper published in Nature talks about how AI and machine learning were now being used to redesign semiconductor base plates, the floor plans of semiconductors, on which those AI ML models will later run. So that is machines improving machines in the hardware. In December 2022, in a paper from Anthropic AI, a spin-out from OpenAI that built ChatGPT, they described how through the application of reinforcement learning through AI feedback, they have now moved further away from reliance on human supervision and closer to the possibility of a self-supervised approach to alignment. So that is now AI and machine learning, or machine learning in this case, being used to make sure that machine learning doesn't do things we don't want it to do. We are approaching Tegmark's position where machines are improving machines and we're approaching it rapidly. In some ways, we're approaching it predictably. The three graphs that you see at the top of the slide describe how increases in computational power, increases in data set size, and increasing numbers of parameters in models consistently improves performance. And that allows those working in the field to say, well, if we can just apply a bit more power, just a bit more data, this is the kind of increased performance we're going to get. On the other hand, what you see in the 8 graphs below it are, for the first time, emergence. So emergences are those things that you couldn't predict from the parts or in advance, but when you get enough complexity, some new property that wasn't previously predictable emerges. And what you see there is large language models like ChatGPT, like GPT-4, getting to a stage now where when you apply more compute, they do things that aren't linear, are completely non-linear, that we did not predict. So you're teaching a language model to learn language on the internet, and suddenly it can do arithmetic. Suddenly it can translate between languages. Suddenly it can translate from human language to code, from code back to human, and from one form of code to another form of code. They weren't predictable. They are emergent properties. They are phase shifts, and they are dizzying. And whilst phase shifts has a real meaningful definition and description in AI and machine learning, I think it's equally applicable to apply analogously in a range of technologies, and that's what we're talking about today. I'm not going to talk about all these technologies. Collective intelligence and cyber-physical infrastructure, Jason will touch on and do far more justice to than I. Ilana will talk about the way in which quantum computing is enabling phase shifts. What I will say is that I think where we're heading is a world where decisions are completely revolutionized, where we have to think about humans as nodes in a wider intelligence network, where we need neuromorphic architectures that match those massive increases in performance with increases in the size, weight, and power that match human capabilities in hardware and in the software that runs on them. A world in which the boundaries between the virtual and physical are blurred through AR and VR, mixed reality, through cyber-physical infrastructure, and a world where explainable AI is absolutely crucial if we're to use these technologies in areas where decisions need to be audited. So they're the technologies, they're the ones that Fujitsu is working on actively in different ways through the centre. I think the other thing to say is, of course, there'll be phase shifts in other technologies like fusion, for example, like in space that sit outside the remit of today. It's a dizzying period to live through, and it's an exciting one. But we need to move from ideas to growth. So how do we do that? I think the first thing that is really positive are things like the recent Tony Blair and William Hague paper calling for cross-party consensus so that we understand how profound these changes are, how they help us to address intractable challenges that drive economic growth, that allow us to address all the other challenges that are political priorities for the different parties. I think we need to match the profundity of the vision that we're seeing and the machinery of government changes that we've seen with real action. So if it's true that we've got a flywheel of productivity begetting productivity and growth begetting growth, we also have a flywheel of investment in R&D, where investment in R&D from government drives private sector investment, which in turn gives the government more money to invest in R&D, which in turn can drive. So we need to begin to see that as the opportunity and not the risk it is, and change the public narrative so they understand that more investment in R&D isn't, in the longer term, less investment in the NHS or less investment for railway workers. I think we need to begin to challenge the narrative across all parties that this growth is going to be principally driven by small and medium enterprises. SMEs alone have an absolutely vital role to play in the economy and in driving economic growth, and we'll explore that later in the series. Nevertheless, the figures from 2020 show that UK business expenditure on R&D, only 11% of that R&D was driven by SMEs. Most of it was driven by large corporates. The recent revision in the figures changed that number quite significantly, and we can come back to that in questions. But if you look at Nightingale and Code's paper back from 2016, they show that increases in productivity from R&D investment are principally driven by investment in large corporates. Why? Because large corporates have the scale with the customers to apply it broadly in multiple domains all at once. I think the next thing to say is we need realism. So we need to help organisations overcome the innovator's dilemma. That is helping customers to de-risk investment in new technologies, helping suppliers like us de-risk investment in new technologies where we can be nervous of not quite getting it right, helping SMEs to come into that ecosystem, and the government putting in money to do it. That's the model for the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, where they have money that they invest that says, well, we'll put in X amount, the customer puts in X amount, the supplier puts in X amount, and now we all innovate and co-create together. The UK has adopted that model from the Catapult, but I think it's still a bit half-hearted. Investment in the Fraunhofers is 2.51 billion a year. Investment in the Catapults is 1.6 billion over 5 years. So we do need to move from the agenda and the ambition and the increasing investment in some areas to really serious investment in really big areas. I think we need digital transformation, the reimagination of society, countries, companies, not just the application of technology. That means breaking down some really hard barriers. I think we face intractable challenges for a long time that we can now begin to tackle through the application of these technologies in new ways. And that ultimately requires investment. It requires a hard-nosed and clear-eyed view of the future and what it holds. And it also requires us to understand that phase shifts are by no means always positive. And we need to think about the kind of disruption this is going to drive in economies, societies and governments to make sure we address those challenges, even as we seize massive opportunity. Thank you.